KZSU-FM Stanford, welcome to another edition of Hearsay Culture. My name is Dave Levine. I'm an associate dean and professor at Elon University School of Law, as well as an affiliate scholar at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School, the University of North Carolina Center for Information Technology and Public Life, and the University of Milan's Information Society Law Center. Today, I have back on the show, I've got to say, probably a Hearsay Culture favorite, maybe based upon the number of times he's been on the show. Professor Mark Lemley from Stanford Law School is joining us today via Zoom on January 23rd, 2025. Anyone in the technology and intellectual property law fields are familiar with Mark's work. Mark is a prolific scholar. We could spend the rest of the next 55 minutes going through all his publications, going back a few decades now. But our purpose today is to dig in a different direction. Aside from the very significant technology challenges from a legal and policy perspective that are confronting us today, again, the TikTok ban, which is theoretically in place by law but may not be getting enforced, issues involving generative artificial intelligence and its use throughout our information ecosystem, not just the intellectual property law issues involving copyright, but more broadly, how it could be used for misinformation and disinformation. And then, of course, social media misinformation and disinformation. Those topics alone could take on several hours. Mark is involved in all of those issues, either both in litigation, but also in writing. And so we're going to talk about those as well. But we're going to start the discussion fundamentally at a very different place. We're recording just a few days after the inauguration of President Trump, and we are finding an unsettled environment, to put it mildly. The new president has come in with a variety, seemingly endless list of executive orders of varying degrees of legality, also covering a wide range of areas. And there is a role for law professors and for academics and for subject matter experts to get involved in policymaking. The time, to put it directly, is now. The time for expertise is now, but it's not easy to do, and it perhaps is a rather difficult proposition in light of the political climate as well as the perspective that many policymakers have on expertise, on academics, and even on input. Mark, as many know, recently went public in releasing Facebook, or Meta, as a client in litigation. He posted about that on social media. It became a bit of news. And by agreement, for ethics reasons, we are not going to discuss that decision per se on today's show. However, I have asked Mark to talk about, which is where we're going to dive in right now, the role of professors more broadly and how professors and academics and subject matter experts might do that work. By a very, very brief introduction, Mark Lemley is the William H. Newcomb Professor of Law at Stanford Law School. He's also the director of the Stanford Program in Law, Science, and Technology. His list of involvements is huge. He's of counsel at Lex Lumina, which he co-founded. He's been named California Lawyers Attorney of the Year twice and received a variety of awards. Mark is joining us via Zoom on January 23rd, 2025. I should note that I am a fellow at CIS, which is under Mark's work, and Mark has been a mentor and friend, but I'm not going to let that get in the way of our discussion. Mark, thank you for joining us today on Hearsay Culture. Thanks for coming back.
Happy to be here.
So let's dive in right into this issue, right? We're in a world where policymakers, right, for decision makers need expertise, and yet it's exceptionally difficult to do that kind of work. Talk a bit right up front about your experience doing that kind of work, again, broadly speaking, and how you see the role of experts in your experience being received or not received when it comes to making policymaking decisions.
I think we're at a very challenging and dangerous moment right now. This is the most dangerous moment I can recall in my lifetime, and I'm 58 years old. And there are various kind of worries and problems and uncertainties, but one of them that seems to cross all sorts of different lines is this, right? I have spent my life as a professor and a scholar trying to add to the world's storehouse of information, right? And I can do that by learning things. I can do that by teaching people. And then, occasionally, hopefully, you can do that by figuring out things that nobody has before, by coming up with new ideas, right? And I think that's true of an enormous number of people in academia, in the sciences, engineering, and so forth. And I think one of the things we're seeing is not just that information and knowledge expertise is not valued in many quarters, but that it is affirmatively disdained. And the idea that rather than sort of the people who've actually done scientific studies, we'll just do our own research, right? Rather than actually following the kind of legal precedents, we'll just kind of declare what we want to do, I think is really dangerous across all kinds of fields. So I think one of the things that academics sort of need to do, and that academic institutions need to do, is to take a stand in favor of truth. And that's something that would have seemed even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, crazy to have to say. That part of the courage of our job has to be to actually say true things. But I think right now that's exactly what takes courage.
And the courage that you talk about, right, for lawyers is what we talk about as facts and evidence, right? Facts and evidence driving decision making. Give us a 60,000-foot view of your experience in bringing facts and evidence on a variety. And again, your work in technology policy runs the gamut. What has it been like prior to this current iteration, right, of policymaking, when you've come forward with not only facts and evidence, but also with positions that differ from those in policymaking positions? And again, by way of disclaimer and full disclosure, you and I worked together over 10 years ago now in opposing the Stop Online, Piracy Act, for example, which was, a popular bill until it wasn't.
Yeah, so I will say, right, my experience kind of over 30 years in teaching has been that people often resist evidence if it doesn't jibe with their preconceptions. The sort of very first year I was in law teaching, I did an empirical study on the patent system and the effects of a change that had just been made to the patent system. And ended up testifying in front of Congress as a result of that. And that upset some folks in Congress, right, who really didn't like the idea that the data didn't support their preconceptions, that we were, at that time, selling out the patent system to Japan, and Japan was going to sort of take over everything as a result of this. So, it's not new that people resist facts and evidence in various quarters when it doesn't sort of connect to their preferred beliefs. To me, I think one of the things that's new and different is the sort of wholesale rejection of the idea of expertise, right, and the idea of knowledge. So rather than I question the basis for your study, I question the sort of motivation behind your study, I want to collect my own study and see if I can see the data differently. The idea that we just don't actually care, right, whether or not the planet is warming, right, whether or not the language of the Constitution says something, right, whether or not the sort of evidence suggests that tariffs are a good idea or a bad idea, right, that we don't look to evidence and facts to try to answer those questions strikes me as a really dangerous direction for the country to go.
What's interesting here is that, where we see broad consensus, where it's easy to point the finger, right? It's always easy to blame someone else, right? And say, that's wrong, right? That's something we shouldn't do. It's a lot harder to say this is right, or it's a lot harder to make that point. And we see that throughout the law. And a lot of this oppositional environment is something that has always been the case in politics, going back to time immemorial. What's changed aside from the interest in facts and evidence? The tenor of the discussions, even within, is what I'm asking about, right? Inside policymaking arenas, as opposed to what people say publicly, has changed as well. Has it not?
Yeah, I think that's right. And, it's not, people sometimes talk about kind of civility and that sort of things, and there's something to that. But I think it's a bigger and deeper problem than that. People have always disagreed. Republicans and Democrats have always disagreed. But I think they've disagreed within a framework, right, that sort of took for granted that what we wanted to do was to sort of preserve the institutions and ideals of the country. And we had different ways of going about that.
Mhm.
right? We had different views about foreign policy. We had different views about affirmative action or gun control or something of that nature. What we're seeing, I think, is a full attack on the idea of America as a pluralistic society, as a democracy, as a whole, right? And so, one of the things that we see just so far in the opening week of the Trump administration, right, is a move to reject the things that have been parts of our institution and parts of our government since the founding, right? The idea of democracy, I think, is under attack, right? When Elon Musk can sort of do the Nazi salute twice at the inauguration and get cheers for it, when the government just decides, when Trump just decides to sort of fire or lay off government officials without any regard for the law, when he signs an executive order like the one that targets birthright citizenship that is just flatly inconsistent with the Constitution, right? Those are direct attacks on the law and the society of the country. And one of the roles, I think, for law, for lawyers and for law professors in that environment, right, is to try to hold on to the rule of law when it is under an attack that is unprecedented in my lifetime.
We're chatting with Mark Lemley of Stanford Law School on KZSU-FM Stanford and Hearsay Culture and Hearsay Culture Media. Another big picture issue here that relates to it, of course, is the fact that perception and reality, right, can be rather different. We've seen these kinds of challenges come up in everything from climate change to some of the issues that we're going to talk about after our break involving technology policy. When you're having conversations, and I'm not asking for names, but when you're having conversations over a period of a few decades here with policymakers themselves, right, one-on-one, again, not public statements, have you sensed the change in how policymakers generally are reacting to that kind of information and how they might process it for purposes of moving policy forward?
I mean, I think the answer probably differs a little bit based on who the policymakers are and who's
Sure.
in power, right? But
Yep. Yep.
I think, I would say I had no shortage of disagreements with the first Trump administration, right? But I
Mhm.
would say one of the things that limited the damage that that administration did to the country was that there were, in fact, smart people in positions of power within the government, right? Who, at least on some of the non-hot button issues, right? I'm
Right.
not thinking about immigration, right? But on
Right.
antitrust policy, right? Were people of good faith, right? And even if they were sort of aimed at, aiming to do something that I didn't think was a good idea, right? They were people who were sort of trying to do their vision of the right thing.
Mhm.
Those people I fear are gone, right? All of
Mhm.
those people got fired or they got disgusted, and the sort of new crop of people may well be people who are much less interested in anything other than either personal gain or the sort of remaking of our society in the image of a fascist state and not a democracy.
And look, it's early days. I mean, literally, it's hard to believe it's only been 3 days since the inauguration because of the amount of information out there, which is another aspect of this, right? Going back to how we can try to impact policy. One can't do everything, right? You can't, and literally when it's this amount of information, which I think is by design, right? You can't possibly keep up with all of it. When you think about the kinds of issues that you take on, and I'm not focusing on your clients here because that's a separate discussion. Really focusing on the broader, right, influencing policy when you have something to say. How do you go about picking areas where you want to have a role other than, again, clients or the interests of clients?
Yeah, no, and look, right. It's not. I mean, I have a lot of views on immigration policy, right? But
Right.
I'm not an immigration policy expert, right? I have a
Well,
lot of views on tariffs and international trade, but that's not my field,
mhm.
right? So I think one thing that everybody has to do is to try to sort of sound the alarm bells if bad things are happening in fields in which they do have expertise, to try to make sure that we're communicating truthful information to the world. And that, I think that's going to matter and depend on who you are,
Hmm.
right? And so, I think the folks who are climate experts have more useful things to say than I do about the nature of climate change, right, and the sort of damage it's already doing to the country.
Hmm.
I think everybody should be speaking up about the issues they care about. But I think from the academic perspective, one of the things that people have to do, right, is kind of sift through the garbage and the misinformation, right, to work to try to sort of both find the truth, but also then to communicate that data, right, to sort of continue to make that information available, right. And one thing to remember is, the U.S. government is not the only game in town, right?
Right. Right.
States are going to play a very big role. If it is the case, as it seems to be the case, that the government really is going to just not hire anybody, lay lots of people off, a bunch of things that we take for granted in this country are going to start breaking.
Hmm.
It's going to be the states and the local governments that pick up some of those pieces. So there, I think there's an opportunity to work with policymakers who maybe are not so motivated by ideology,
Hmm.
and then in the rest of the world, the tech companies, right, may well have successfully cozied up to Trump, and therefore will get their rewards in the form of dropping antitrust cases or other regulatory benefits in the United States. But that doesn't mean it's going to be true in Europe.
Right.
And there's still room, I think, for kind of science, for evidence, for advocacy and logic to work elsewhere in the world.
Right. And look, you're at Stanford, right? You're within, not a short walk, but walking distance of many of the giants in the technology world. This show is on KZSU, Stanford's radio station, beamed literally right into the Bay Area. I'm affiliated with Stanford, and here we are talking about, and we are talking about technology giants, and this is not an easy discussion to have for those, which is my question, who don't have job security, right? Who don't have tenure, right? You're a chair professor. I'm tenured at Elon University. There are limits to that power. There's certain things I cannot do, right? But I can certainly express an opinion, right, with regard to my areas of expertise. And I'm not concerned, right, that Elon is going to let me go. And obviously, you're not concerned that Stanford would do that. But not many of our colleagues don't have that. And that's putting aside, which I want to ask you about, universities that are more or less under attack, right? Because of things that professors are saying from those outside. What do you say though first to professors and academics and advocates that don't, beyond academia, that don't have job security like we are fortunate to have when they want to do something which will have pushback? What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the answer is right is got to be situational, right?
Mhm.
Everybody, people can do what they can do. I understand, right? I find myself in a sort of position of privilege, and one of the
Mhm.
reasons that I sort of feel an obligation to speak up,
Mhm.
right, to speak truth to power, as Anita Hill once called it, right,
Right.
right, is that the consequences for me are significantly less, right?
Right.
It
Mhm.
may mean I don't have a client that sort of pays consulting fees that I otherwise would have,
Right.
right? But it doesn't mean I don't have a job. It doesn't mean I get fired, right? Lose my health insurance and various other things.
Mhm.
And so I think everybody kind of has an obligation to learn and understand what's going on in the world and to speak up, even if it's privately, right, to their friends, to their family, right, about the sort of harm that's being done. I
Mhm.
think anybody who has the ability and the courage to do it should be speaking up publicly about the damage that's being done. But those of us who actually are in a position where we are somewhat insulated from the consequences, I think have a correspondingly greater obligation
Mhm.
to speak up when we see bad things being done.
Would you say the same thing inside the classroom in terms of how these issues are discussed internally in a classroom itself? Of course, like you said, it could differ if the class is constitutional law or race in the law, versus tax law, although everything has a political element to it. But what would you say to people inside the classroom about how to discuss these kinds of issues in a way that allows, and I'm thinking of law students, but certainly academics, right, to make good decisions?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's a challenge because the sort of outspoken advocacy and speaking truth to power that I feel comfortable engaging in, right, in the outside world, I think runs up a little bit against the classroom situation where you are the person in power speaking to people who are in a different relationship, right? So I don't think it's appropriate to say like this is the right way and no one can disagree with it, right? And
Right.
particularly in law schools, one of the things that we hope to foster is debate and disagreement, right, and learning from each other. I think that is more challenging if, in fact, some of that debate and disagreement just sort of rejects as out of bounds kind of truth or facts or history or precedent, right? And
Mhm.
so managing that, I think, is always going to be about allowing people to sort of express their views, right? Even if you fundamentally disagree with them,
Yeah.
right? But not allowing people to have their own facts, right?
Yeah.
Not allowing them to sort of like just deny the world. I will say, from my perspective, right, as somebody who teaches patent law and antitrust law,
Right.
I am very lucky that while there are plenty of issues that people are free to disagree with in my classes, they tend not to be the kind of fundamental oppositional issues that we see in other classes.
Yeah, and without question, although when I teach internet law and we're talking about misinformation and some of those issues, it can get political quickly, but it is without question easier to avoid those issues in in many areas than it is in others. One other issue, Mark, which you have dealt with directly, is allegations that academics are captured, right? I mean, there have been public allegations made against you and many others that Google is funding everything you do, or your client is X, and therefore you take this position, and therefore, right, the implication is your opinion is not worth anything more than anyone else who's paid for it, and you should really be ignored. Funding, of course, is essential to operations of any business. But how have you and how would you respond to those kinds of issues going forward in light of the fact that I would expect there's going to be even more of that going on in terms of the allegations made as we move forward?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's the role that I find myself in, where my full-time job is teaching, right, but
Yeah.
where I also have a consulting practice, right,
Yeah.
is one in which I have to wear two different hats, right?
Right.
And I think part of that is understanding precisely what your role is and isn't in each of those circumstances. And so, for me, as someone who is first and foremost an academic, right, I am never gonna let a client relationship, right, interfere with my willingness to say what's right. And if
Mhm.
in fact I feel like that's going to happen, then I'm not going to have that client relationship anymore.
Right.
It is absolutely the case, as you suggested, that that an easy way to try to go after people whose arguments you cannot respond to on the merits is to say, "Oh, this is just bought and paid for."
Mhm.
I think I understand why people do that as a kind of cynical policy move, but I find it very frustrating. The Google thing in particular. I
Right.
last worked for Google in a patent case.
Mhm.
I have done the work for them in other matters. I last worked for Google in a patent case 22 years ago.
Right.
But boy, if I write an article that somebody doesn't like in the patent system, it must somehow be bought and paid for by Google.
Mhm.
Uh, uh, you know, maybe as a result of some of the things I've been saying about the tech industry, people will, if nothing else, stop thinking the tech industry must somehow be behind it.
Yeah, well, I mean, we are in, in that sense, very different waters because a number of people. I mean, yours was a very specific instance, and you were public about it. But others, names don't matter right now, are also kind of coming up, particularly after Meta's announced change in how they're dealing with facts and so forth, and said, boy, I'm having a hard time defending, and not as a lawyer, but just generally defending this company, and I think time will tell how that plays out. We're chatting with Mark Lemley of Stanford Law School on KZSU-FM Stanford and Hearsay Culture and Hearsay Culture Media. This is a nonprofit, non-commercial radio station at Stanford University that requires donations to continue its operations. Please consider donating to us at donate@kzsu.stanford.edu and check out Hearsay Culture Media at hearsayculture.com. Mark, last point here, kind of big picture, in terms of policy influence. I've already talked about the fire hose scenario that we're currently facing in terms of the number of issues, but there's also a lot of issues that are off the radar screen. We're going to talk about some high profile ones because they are essential, and both of us are in those areas, but there's a lot of stuff going on that it will not get attention, that does not get attention, and that frankly, lots of people won't care about. They're not going to go to social media to talk about, for example, advisory committees, FACAs, A few people will, but most people say, what's a FACA? And then they'll come up with some kind of pun for it, and then ignore it because it's not something, it's inside baseball. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And many people have subject matter expertise in areas that are not Section 230 is about to talk about, or social media or misinformation and so forth. What do you say to those folks? What do you say to the people? And I know you've done some of that work too. It's not like everything you've done has gotten all of that attention. What do you say to people who say, you know what, I've got an important but niche area that social media is not going to care about, that even advocates may not be paying attention to in civil society, but I want to do something. What do you say to those people?
Well, I mean, I think in some sense, those are the best opportunities, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and so, obviously different people in different fields are going to have different connections and different opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, for instance, one of the roles of law and lawyers, in a situation like the one we find ourselves in, is not just attacking the things that are clearly unconstitutional overreaches, like the no birthright citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
That's important to do,
Which literally, apparently, a federal judge in Washington just put on hold, literally a few minutes before we recorded. Yeah.
There is literally no question at all under the law that the order is unconstitutional. Lawyers never tell you that there is 100% certainty in the law. There is 100% certainty in the law. The only question is, will we find courts follow the law or not? I think it's important that people do those. Those are high profile. Those are interesting. Mm-hmm. But I think in some sense, the role of the lawyer in the obscure stuff is much more important, So the idea that Elon Musk is going to sort of have an advisory committee that doesn't follow the process rules we have for advisory committees, Mm-hmm. The idea that we're going to change the way civil service employees are designated in ways that makes it possible to fire career employees in order to replace them with political appointees, those are obscure things, but they're things that people who have kind of some knowledge and expertise can really weigh in on, mm-hmm. can really participate in, and maybe have a larger impact at the margins, than on some of the bigger picture issues.
Which ties to an important point, which is, and I'm going to say it in a way that critics of, which are many of the Trump administration would say, maybe, a broken clock is right twice a day. It is possible, I hope, to actually find areas of commonality, even within the current administration going forward. And of course, it's a lot easier to support something that's already in process of happening, or it's going to pass in policymaking than not. Now, admittedly, I will say, regardless of the administration, Republican or Democrat, I tend to be in the other direction. But I occasionally have been involved in someone's like, hey, this is great, and let's work on doing it better. You don't have a crystal ball. I'm not asking that question. But how do you find that kind of stuff, too? I mean, it may be possible that there are experts who could, in a bipartisan or nonpartisan way, help make things that are starting to happen.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. And it's, one of the things that's sort of remarkable about the period in which we find ourselves is, right, the Republican Party of 20 years ago doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Literally all the people in the office, right, who would have had an ideology that we would have associated with the Republican Party are gone, right? They're just not there anymore, right? And the new party, which is in some sense the kind of like Trump party of personality, right, I think is problematic in many ways. But I also think there may be circumstances in which they present opportunities for policy change that old style Republicans would have opposed. So 2 points there, right? One, I think, is antitrust law. So remains to be seen. The sort of antitrust appointments we've seen are a little bit of a mixed bag, but I think there's some reason to believe that the classic way we thought about antitrust, which is Democrats do more enforcement and Republicans do less enforcement, may not turn out to be true, right? That there's a populist antitrust wing in the Republican Party that may well continue to bring cases, right? And so being able to sort of work with folks to sort of try to see if the big cases will continue against the tech companies, for instance. I think that's an important area. Another, I think, is the TikTok ban, right?
Which we're about to talk about.
I found myself in the sort of remarkable position of filing a brief on the same side as Donald Trump, trying to avoid the TikTok ban. We lost 9-0 in the Supreme Court.
Right.
So, I think there are absolutely opportunities to work with people who actually want good policy outcomes. The big unknown and the big worry is whether the corruption that we're already starting to see overshadows all of this, right? Whether what we get is not a reprieve for TikTok, right? But can we sell it to my cronies or make it into a right-wing political area, right? Whether we get from antitrust, not continued enforcement from a populist wing, but exemptions and carve-outs for the dominant tech firms who went and kissed the ring and paid enough money at the inauguration. We don't know what's going to happen there, right? But I think working with the people who are actually trying to work in good faith to enforce the law is still something worth doing.
And, we're chatting with Mark Lemley of Stanford Law School on KZSU and Hearsay Culture. Mark, this to me is such an important issue. I want to harp on it for a moment. We're already seeing, just in these first few days, pushback from, quarters that would otherwise be supportive of even the few elected officials so far who have said, I want to try to work with the administration, or I'm talking about Democrats. And you see a lot of pushback on that, saying, the phrase now is, quote unquote, bending the knee, right? And moving in a direction, the implication is, that goes against your principles. And particularly, coming back to the academic arena, but also policy matter experts, right? We have to be able to look for those areas of commonality to the extent that we want the law to improve. And so, one reaction that, I've seen is that pushback. And then another, and I want to get your reaction to it, right? I've seen a lot of grief given to a few people who have said, I hope that the president succeeds, right? The President Trump succeeds, because it would be bad for the country if he doesn't. Now, of course, that could also depend on the policy which you're talking about. But if we go back to the fundamentals where we started the discussion, the rule of law, right? It would seem that at the floor, the rule of law is what we want to have continue, and that trying to find that commonality which leads to success, again, in areas where we might agree we should have that success, has to be a good thing, right? Or am I wrong?
Well, so you said, right, I hope the president succeeds because that means things will get better. I would amend that a bit. I hope the country succeeds. Right? It's not at all obvious to me that the country survives this. If it does, it will be because people of goodwill work together to make things happen, to make the government survive, to make the country sort of survive and heal itself. Whether or not Donald Trump and many of his appointees are on board with that agenda is not clear to me. Right? And so, what I totally empathize with this, right? And one of the things that's been sort of true for the last couple of decades is right, the Republicans are the people who like to break things, and then the Democrats come around and they kind of try to put it all back together, but they don't put it back together fast enough. So we
Hmm.
elect Republicans, and the Republicans just break some more things,
Hmm.
right? If the goal of the politicians and the Republican side is in fact to try to improve the country, then maybe that you can work with them, right?
Hmm.
If the goal is to enable Donald Trump to steal as much money as quickly as he
Right.
can, if the
Right.
goal is to turn us into a state like Hitler's Germany, right, where we engage in mass deportations of both citizens and non-citizens, where we take away fundamental rights and freedoms.
Yeah.
No, that's not something I think anybody should be working alongside, right?
Right.
And there, I think the answer is the only choice you have is to be part of the resistance.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, and I think you've articulated, what is ultimately maybe the biggest challenge now, which is how you simultaneously support the continued good operations of the United States and therefore support the continuation of our government, while at the same time prevent all of the harms and massive problems that would be engendered by it. I wouldn't be doing my job as a journalist here, Mark, if I didn't backstep a couple of minutes here and just ask you, walk through with us. You said, you're not sure that we survive this. Can you describe your biggest concern in terms of how we get to the point where we're not surviving what may be coming?
So, I don't know. I am an optimist by nature, right? It's
Hmm.
it's hard to be an optimist in 2025, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So I am hopeful that the country can weather this. Here's my worry, right? Which is we have a government that at the very top is dedicated to breaking down the rule of law, right? Dedicated to breaking down the institutions that have kept the country running, right? And is kind of interested in sort of personal aggrandizement and personal profit, right?
Hmm.
Not actually making the country run well, right?
Hmm.
And if they succeed at that, right, if the courts aren't willing to stop the illegal activities, if they can't, right, then I think things start to look really bad, right? They look bad economically. We go into a spiral. We impose a bunch of tariffs that raise costs on a bunch of people who voted for Donald Trump because they thought prices were already too high.
Hmm.
We deport 10 million people who are doing the low wage jobs that enable us to have food and housing, and we don't have those things anymore, or they get far
Hmm.
more expensive, right? And that causes people to get more and more upset.
Hmm.
Combine that with the rest of the world, which I think right now views us either as idiots or patsies, right? And we see a fundamental potential for realignment away from Western values and the idea of democracy. It's very easy for Russia or China to make a pitch that says, look at what happened to America, right? These people, obviously, this system doesn't work, right?
Hmm.
You need our approach, you need our guidance, and we turn a bunch of countries that might otherwise have been on the path to freedom and democracy in a very different direction.
Hmm.
And I think the combination of those things, right, of sort of losing the power and influence that we have abroad, of losing the sort of economy at home, and the risk if we really are going to try to eliminate most of the federal government,
Right.
which is the sort of claim that the doggy department is
Hmm.
making.
Hmm.
Right.
Hmm.
It turns out that a lot of people don't they rely on their government in ways they don't know they rely on, right?
Right.
And when the
Right.
social security checks stop coming,
Hmm.
right, when the Medicare reimbursements stop coming, when the planes fall out of the sky,
Hmm.
people are
Hmm.
not going to be happy.
Hmm.
And the risk I think there is, right, the sort of right-wing disinformation machine then starts to do precisely what we saw in Germany in the 1930s, which is we can't be the ones to blame. We got to sort of point the finger at somebody else. It's the
Hmm.
immigrant, it's the brown person. They're the ones to blame,
Hmm.
and things go downhill very fast.
Yeah.
So, as I said, like this is a worst case scenario. I don't
Right.
think it's
Right.
going to happen. I hope it's not going to happen. But the chances of it happening are a lot higher now than they have ever been in my lifetime. and they're a lot higher now than they were in 2016.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it seems that way. Okay, last question on this before we get to some specific policy issues. Courts. All right, I asked this question of people in during the first Trump administration. I'm going to ask. This is the first time I'm asking the question again on hearsay culture. Do you think the courts, right, can withstand the pressure that is already being brought to bear on the system? What's your take on the resilience of the court system and the judiciary to maintain the rule of law, to have orders that are not only issued but enforced, right, and have the ability to maintain the kind of respect that a populace needs in order for the judiciary to operate?
Yeah, and this is the real wild card for me, right? And so
Mhm.
I think one of the things that was kind of most shocking to people in the legal world was the Supreme Court's, frankly, lawless decision to block the prosecution of Donald Trump last summer.
Mhm.
Right, that was a rejection of history, of the Constitution, of the rule of law, I think in a frankly nakedly political way.
Mhm.
I don't think that that is how the court views itself. I don't think that's how it wants to view itself.
Mhm.
Um, a lot of this work is going to be done in the first instance in the district courts and the courts of
Right.
appeals. And there are a bunch of people who are judges appointed by all presidents who are people of goodwill who will try to apply the law.
Mhm.
Not all of them. There are definitely judges who are pure political actors, right, who will do whatever Donald Trump tells them to, and that's an unfortunate fact about our system.
Mhm.
But I think there is still room for the rule of law to prevail
Mhm.
if we, if judges take their oath of office seriously and stand up for the rule of law, even against political pressure. Whether that's going to happen across the board, and whether it's going to happen at the very top, I think really is going to be one of the most important determinants of, right, whether our legal system and our democracy can survive.
My students have heard from me more or less since about 2016. I tell all of my students that, we, the judiciary and officers of the court, are the bulwark against chaos, right? I mean, below the rule of law is not a place that anyone wants to be. And on a personal level, particularly being that I live in North Carolina, right? We've seen frontal assaults across the board, including efforts which failed to gerrymander the courts in the state courts in North Carolina, which never actually happened. But I was
Well,
pleased to see, yeah,
and an
yeah,
effort to keep from seating the Supreme Court justice who
with
won the election, right? Because
with
she's a
yeah,
Democrat.
yes, which is happening right now in North Carolina. And for listeners who aren't familiar, about 60,000 votes are being challenged by the Republican candidate, who lost by a little over 700 votes in several recounts. And that's an ongoing issue. Mark, let's turn in the last, about 17 or 18 minutes to some lighter issues. They're not that light, but let's turn immediately, right? Because we've been alluding to it, right? The social media misinformation. So we see the TikTok ban as it stands right now, right? The ban is legally in place, but it's not being enforced. There are various machinations to which you referred. Both of us opposed the ban. I signed a brief that was drafted by Anupam Chander on First Amendment grounds. There's a lot of things there by way of caveat, but my question is kind of a little bit different, which is, putting aside the national security concerns, which I personally think are real, the fundamental question is the role of social media in society. We know that people are getting their news from social media companies, right? And how the algorithms serve up information. We also are now seeing, what these different companies are intending to do. Are we asking, and what should we ask of social media companies when it comes to these issues? But to put it differently, are we asking these companies too much? I mean, at the end of the day, they're speech platforms. They're putting content out there, and we those that want better, right, are expecting them to be editors. We're expecting them to make fundamental decisions. I've seen some comments saying, you shouldn't trust a billionaire to decide what information you need to know, right? And as we look at how this is playing out, to play that, other side or devil's advocate position, are we asking too much of them? Their speech platforms, let them put out the content that they're going to put out.
Yeah, so I mean, I think well, so the on the kind of like these are speech platforms and
Yeah.
everybody can then just speak there, right? So
Yeah.
the first thing to understand is right, that's just not true,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
The everything you see in social media is heavily curated, and it has to be.
Hmm.
Right. Even before the sort of fights over disinformation, right? Facebook was taking down nearly 2 billion accounts a year that were fake and spam accounts, right?
Hmm.
Now, it's taking down fewer of them. There's more fake accounts out there in the world than there used to be, in part because they need to juice their membership numbers.
Right.
But there is no way that you could simply say we will let anyone speak who wants to, and it'll all get thrown to you, right? You don't.
Hmm.
What you'll have is a social media platform that rapidly becomes useless. It becomes buried in spam, in porn,
Hmm.
in hate speech, and various other things.
Right.
So every one of these platforms has to regulate content that's on the site, and it has to decide what content they're going to show you.
Right.
And so the only question is, right, how do they do it? And sort of whether they're transparent in the way in which they do it, right? And so I
Hmm.
think one of the things we saw with the 2024 election in particular is right the day of legacy media is over, right?
Hmm.
In part,
Hmm.
it was deliberately killed by some folks who right bought newspapers and radio stations right in order to kind of change their views. But in part, it's just that's not where people get their information. There is no
Right.
trusted source anymore, right?
Hmm.
And so they're going to listen to whatever content the social media platforms they use decides to promote to them. So I think it becomes all the more important that we know what those biases are, what the platforms are promoting, right? Elon Musk buys Twitter, right, saying he's going to turn it into a free speech platform, and then the very first thing he does is blocks anyone who disagrees with him, blocks any sort of like journalists who might have a challenging perspective to him, and
Hmm.
affirmatively promotes a bunch of sort of false information.
Right.
He has the right to do that, but we have the right to know about it. And I
Hmm.
think we also have the right, and this is where I think the law could be proactive,
Hmm.
right? I think the real problem is people don't feel like they have a choice,
Yeah. Hmm.
right? That the one of the risks of the TikTok ban is there aren't very many places people felt like they could go and get news that wasn't in fact being fed to them by billionaires.
Right.
TikTok has its problems and it's got its own algorithm that's making its own decisions, but the more options there are out there with different approaches, the better. And
Hmm.
so when I think about Facebook and Instagram basically following Twitter/X down the path of kind of promoting the right wing agenda, which I fear is exactly what's going to happen.
Hmm.
Um, right. And then I think about TikTok either being banned or being sort of brought under the thumb of Donald Trump, right, who now owns their continued existence, right, or being sold to Elon Musk,
Right.
right. We start to see an ecosystem where the only places people get information are places that are going to be curating that information in ways that favor illiberal and sort of neo-fascist viewpoints over either a kind of true free expression of we'll let everybody speak, right, or something where truth turns out to make a difference.
And certainly, the political winds being what they are, and these companies being for profit, it shouldn't surprise anyone that we see these companies saying, you know what, wait a minute, the American public, although it's a misnomer, it was not a majority vote, 49.8% of the vote went to Trump, right? Is enough of a way to say, you know what, we're here to make money, and the public apparently doesn't want this version of Facebook, right? They want that version of Facebook, and as long as the person in power wants to work with me, here's $1 million for the inauguration, and so forth. In other words, from a profit-making perspective, and as you know, I've written about this for 20 years now, from a profit-making perspective, the values align completely. which is kind of from that perspective, which is a second point that I want to ask you about, which is the role of consumers and individuals in curating information themselves, right? We used to call that media literacy, right? We used to call that, or knowing your source. And it seems like, and this is at least the empirical evidence suggests, it goes across generations, that people, the only I saw it on TV and I believe it. Right now, it's I saw it on social media and I believe it. How much of a responsibility do you think the public has or should take on in curating their own information to say that doesn't look right, that doesn't sound right, I'm not going to follow it? And again, going back to this point that I'm pushing on, right? And therefore, you figure it out, you've been exposed.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously, in the world in which we live, you have to do that,
Mm-hmm.
right? When I see something that seems too good or too bad to be true, right, I want to go check it. I want to go find another source. I want to make sure it's not sort of fake news.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, people have to do that in the modern world. I will say it's much harder than it used to be, right?
Yeah.
It is true
Yeah.
that, the people just believe what they saw on television. That had some significant effects. But it had less effects, right, when the answer was there were 3 channels to choose from,
Right.
and news reporters who had kind of ethics and reasonable decisions. We still hid a bunch of bad things about the world, right? They didn't make it onto the nightly news, but they weren't affirmatively promoting, using bleach to treat COVID, or dating Greenland, or climate denialism, or any of the sort of other sort of craziness that's out there, right? So, so I think the window for things that people could just see and then believe, right, is much, much greater than it used to be, and that makes it harder to sort of pick out what's real. And the second thing that makes it harder is with the sort of growth of AI, of deep fakes, right? It's much easier to sort of produce fake news, to produce misinformation, and to disseminate it. And so there's more out there to be avoided, and it looks more realistic than it used to, right?
Yeah.
And so. Yeah. So is it incumbent on people to kind of, have some skepticism? Yeah. But I also think it is incumbent on people in positions of power, right, to try to make that better and not to make it worse, right? And so when we see the Elon Musks of the world in the election deliberately sharing false videos that purport to be Kamala Harris doing something when she's not, right, that is evil. It's just that's just evil. It is affirmatively harming our society, and there is no excuse or justification for it. When we see, right, the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world saying, you know what, our response to this is not going to be make people's lives easier in figuring out what's true and what's not, but affirmatively make people's lives harder, right? That's not justifiable. That's not defensible to me, and I think it's something that's going to make the role of the consumer of media much more challenging, and then therefore it's going to make democracy much more challenging.
Zuckerberg, I think would say, among other things, we're using the community notes method, right, which we saw used on Twitter and X. I'm not aware and of empirical studies or a lot of studies to know whether that actually works. In other words, can we actually rely upon it? But putting that aside, what do you make of that response? I mean, a cynical view is that it's another way of saying, we don't care anymore. On the other hand, others could say, well, we don't have to do that either. So, I'm not asking you to read Zuckerberg's mind. I'm curious, and I know, again, to be clear, you represented Meta, so I'm not asking about Meta per se. It's more kind of a broader question, which is, what do you think is going on in the social media ecosystem that would explain a reaction like that, as opposed to just saying, you know what? Again, I'm going back to the theme I've been using, right, which is just put it out there, and someone wants to say it's wrong, say it's wrong. In other words, they don't have to do notes either.
Yeah. So, right. I mean, I think it's first thing to note is content moderation is hard, right?
Yeah.
It has to be done. There's literally no choice but to do it, but it's also super hard. And so I think one of the things that Meta was legitimately reacting to is they got it wrong a lot, right? They had to do it at an enormous scale. So they delegated it to AI, right? Among other things, right? And, right, they got it wrong. I get that. Are community notes going to be better? Certainly the experience on X is not particularly encouraging, right? In
Right,
two
right.
respects, right? One is the misinformation gets to fly a really long way before there are enough people writing a community note that get enough of a consensus that it might get shown to somebody,
Yeah,
right? So it
yeah.
turns out that it's only after you've misinformed an enormous number of people that we might see a
Right,
community note, right?
right,
And
right.
that I think is a fundamental difference between an ex ante and a community-based ex post approach.
Hmm.
The other problem, of course, is that community notes themselves can be misinformation, right? And
Hmm.
so relying on the public to fact check you might tell you, you know what, you shouldn't actually take ivermectin to treat COVID, but it
Right.
might actually have a bunch of people who say, hey, you shouldn't take the vaccines, they're dangerous and they're going to hurt you, because those people are themselves promoting misinformation. And so if we
Yeah.
see community notes on true statements that kind of wrongly suggest falsehoods, I think that's more of a problem.
Yeah.
I think Meta's got another issue, right? Which is, X is a public site,
Yeah.
and so anything
Yeah.
you post, right, the community as a whole and the commentators can see and respond to. I don't know what you do about a post that I make to my friends on Facebook.
Yeah.
Are,
Yeah.
are we going to allow? Are we going to show that to the public, even though I said I only want it to friends? That doesn't seem like a great idea. Are we
Right.
only going
Right.
to have the community of my friends note it, or are we going to say nope, no content moderation at all unless it's a public post? None
Yeah.
of those seem like a particularly great solution. So, as I said, I don't like on this issue. To me, this change is emblematic, but it is, in some sense, the least problematic change that Meta made,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And I think it's sort of when you combine it with a bunch of other things,
Right.
right, like affirmatively changing policies around LGBTQ,
Right.
right, affirmatively
Right.
taking down options for people to communicate in that community, right? That suggests that this isn't merely we're trying to do a better job of content moderation, but we are trying
Yeah.
to affirmatively change the mix of content that goes into the system.
Well, yes, and certainly others have commented that when you allow a speech code within a platform that allows for human beings, right, who are transgender, for example, to be labeled "quote it," right, you're dealing with an inhumanity which belies any principle that a civilized society operates on. Let me, in the last couple of minutes here, because we have plenty of time to talk about generative AI, but I want to tie it into what we just talked about very quickly. Let's stipulate that with regard to ChatGPT and OpenAI and really any other companies, that there's a strong fair use argument, which I think there is. But that issue also ties into this media ecosystem, and certainly we've seen the New York Times and others, really make the implicit argument that look, this content, and this is an old argument that goes back to the dawn of the internet and before, right? We're creating the content, you're using it, you're making money, we're not getting money, and so therefore licensing might be a way to go in order to maintain legacy media and allow content creators to have income. What's your reaction broadly to that perspective? Again, putting aside the notion that from a copyright perspective, there's a very strong fair use argument.
Yeah, so I mean, I think they're right. So
Yeah,
one question is, should I have to pay a license when the law says I don't have to pay a license?
more or
Right?
less, right? Yeah, yeah,
I think the answer to that should be no. And
right.
I will note that one of the problems with the fair use doctrine is
Mm.
it has this circularity to it, right? So if I do pay licenses, now maybe there's a licensing market, and so everybody else says, well, wait a minute, I should get paid too.
Right.
I think I understand the impulse that says you're using my stuff to train your data, and therefore I should get paid.
Mhm.
I will say we don't use that impulse anywhere else in the world, right? None of the New York Times reporters send checks to their fifth grade English teachers, even though they are the reason they know how to structure sentences, right? We take for granted in our society a whole bunch of learning and spillovers and positive feedbacks that we don't try to track down and compensate. So I think it's a problem if generative AI takes a substantial text from a New York Times article or a book or anything else and puts it in the output, right?
Mhm.
If they actually are generating outputs that are substantially similar, that is something that's a problem. It's something they probably ought to have to pay for. That
Mhm.
happens extremely rarely, and when it does, there's usually one of a couple of reasons behind it that we can
Mhm.
talk about if you want to.
Mhm.
But I think the other thing that is worth noting about the licensing market piece is there is a real disconnect between what most people kind of have in mind when they talk about licensing for generative AI and the realities of the world, right? So let's take as an example something like Stable Diffusion, right, which is trained on 2 billion images. The whole company, I don't know what's worth now, maybe less than this, but at its height, maybe was worth $2 billion. Right? If you said, you know what, we're going to take half of all of the revenue or half of the value of the entire company, more than their revenue, and we're going to pay it out to content owners, everybody gets 50 cents.
Right.
For the training of their work for generative AI. I don't think that's what people have in mind. They're not thinking, I'll get paid 50 cents and then I'll be fine. I think there are a bunch of people who don't want their work used in AI at all. There are a bunch of people who have stars in their eyes and think I should get an enormous amount of money. But the reality of the situation is there may be a few big companies, the Gettys or Shutterstocks of the world, maybe the New York Timeses of the world, whose content is aggregated enough and important enough that they will get paid something. But individual people who've got blog posts, right, and those blog posts are 1/10 billionth of the training data set. I just don't think the math works there. And to the extent it works at all, it drives us in what I think is exactly the wrong direction for AI, which is we consolidate among the big players and the tech incumbents. And we're already seeing those moves, right? Almost all, not all, but almost all of the big AIs start out as independent, and then they start tying up one by one to the big tech incumbents. That only accelerates if the answer is, you know what, you can't even get in this game unless you start paying hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in licensing fees.
We're going to have to end there, Mark, in the interest of time, but more to follow. We're chatting with Mark Lemley on KZSU-FM, Stanford, and Hearsay Culture. Mark, thanks so much for joining us today. Appreciate your insights and look forward to having you back on the show in the near future.
Thank you, Dave.
Thanks for listening to Hearsay Culture today. Please stay tuned to KZSU for more diverse programming. Check out Hearsay Culture Network for all of our new shows and content, and have a great day.